the Yellow Turbans, a rebellious folk who rose up against their oppressors. And in this video, we'll show you who they rose up with, looking at all the units in the army and what they may be able to do out on the battlefield. The Yellow Turbans DLC is the closest thing we have to a different faction in Total War 3 Kingdoms. This is going to focus on how the units perform in battle and isn't anything to do with campaign. Anywho, onwards for the glory of heaven. Let us begin with our generals, beginning with the scholar Huang Shao. Scholars are good against enemy heroes, and Huang Shao is a pretty good all-rounder. He's got decent damage in both the stats, normal and armor piercing, and has a couple of abilities which will add some damage as well, so he's got pretty good damage output overall. He doesn't have a shield though, so watch out for archers and missiles, but overall he's a man useful in many situations. And then we have the most powerful himself, He-Man, or Herman, if you want to kind of pronounce it properly. Now, while he lacks a little bit in the armor piercing damage department, he does have crazy good melee evasion, so he's good at surviving, and he also has a bow, so he can hybrid between melee or ranged if he wants to, but just be sure to keep him clear of any heavy armor because he won't do too well fighting it in melee. And while he is a scholar who again is good at fighting enemy generals, heavily armored ones may be a little bit of a downside for him. And then to our first veteran, Gong Du. Veterans are good at holding out against enemy troops and staying alive. Gong Du's weapon damage is pure armor piercing, and he's got a whole lot of it, so go for those heavily armored units with Gong Du and he will gong bonk them all on the head, including generals. He also has a nice bit of armor on to help him survive better. In terms of abilities, he's got one that can slow down the enemies and some that can speed him up. And he, like a few others, also has guerrilla deployment, so he can deploy his entire retinue outside of that original deployment zone. And then another veteran in Zhang Kai. Another good all-rounder, split weapon damage 50-50 in both. Good amount of armor, again helping him survive. He is a veteran, that is what they do. Although his morale is a little bit low, so he may not hang around as long as you'd like. He's going to be useful in many situations for holding lines and just wearing units down. In terms of abilities, he can make his enemies vulnerable by reducing their armor and melee evasion, and decrease ability cooldown time. And then we have Pei Yuan Shao. Another veteran with that big armor piercing damage, so look for those heavily armored boys as he should be able to put out a lot of damage. Although he doesn't have as good a charge bonus as Gong Du, he does have more armor though, so he can put out a little bit less damage but survive a little bit better. His abilities are mostly geared towards more damage or melee evasion. And to our one and only healer, He Yi. Now, healers are supposed to be good at inspiring troops and fighting at range, although he doesn't have a bow, so I'm not really sure what that means. I assume it's the length of his spear perhaps, as it's a long weapon. Now, damage output isn't great for He Yi. He doesn't have much normal damage and only an average amount of armor piercing damage, so don't expect him to be getting all the kills or tanking out all the damage. His strength comes in supporting his troops, staying around the front line maybe, boosting that morale. As it said, he inspires his troops. So going to be good at keeping them around and keeping them fighting for longer, and his abilities work to this end, increasing morale, increasing melee evasion, and reducing enemy damage potentially. So to our melee infantry, beginning with peasant warriors. Now their job is very simple. Die as brutally as possible so that nobody else in the army has to. Of course, they're not great at a lot of things, mostly there to absorb missiles, get in the way of cavalry and take their charges, protect the important units basically. As they are of course very cheap, you can bring them in abundance, kind of suicide them into things. You could try and flank around with them and get after some missiles. They may get charged by cav and routed, but hey, no big loss. Now if you want someone equally sucky in melee, you could go for chanters, but they are a special unit indeed. While they don't have much in the way of melee stats, either attack or defense, they are a support unit, so they will boost the morale of nearby friendly units, and they'll also boost the damage and armor of nearby friendly units. So they are a support unit overall, good for staying near other troops, fighting alongside other troops, because if they fight anything by themselves, they're probably not going to do too well. They need somebody mixed in with them to help them survive. So mixing one or two of these units in with your front line could be a strong move. And then we've got the Yellow Turban Warriors. These boys are your first proper melee infantry, but they are of the average variety. They've got some armor, they've got some shield protection, they've got a little bit of non-armor piercing damage, so an average but well-rounded frontline unit potentially. Good for mixing in with your stronger troops as they can absorb some of the damage and help those stronger units stay alive. And to one of those stronger units it may want to protect, the Venerable Wu. They don't have a lot of armor on, so missiles could be a problem for them, but their melee evasion is pretty fantastic, so in melee they will dodge damage pretty well. Their unit is only half the size of a full regular unit, but they can put out damage which is fairly spread across both base and armor piercing, decent charge, decent morale. They also cause scare and have poisoned weapons, and as it lists, they are a flanking unit primarily because they're pretty fast on their feet. They could be used to get around the side of troops pretty quick. Just have to watch out for those cav charges and missiles. And then we've got some absolute nutters in the Yellow Sky Heralds. These boys are a little bit crazy. They are unbreakable, so they won't rout. They are unruly, which means they may lose control and you won't be able to control them anymore. They'll just do whatever the hell they want. They don't have much armor or defense, but they can put out a decent amount of armor piercing damage, so they may actually be pretty useful for taking down those heavily armored units, those elite units, because they won't rout and they will keep fighting to the last man, so they'll be able to keep damage output and maybe stay around for a long time as well, holding a position if that's needed. On to Scholar Warriors, another unit that's only half size. They've got 120 instead of 240. This is on extreme unit sizes, which suggests they are pretty damn strong, and if you look at their stats, well, it'll tell you that they are. They've got a whole lot of melee defense, a whole lot of non-armor piercing damage, some shield defense, okay armor, good morale. They can dish out some damage and survive pretty well, so a strong frontline choice. Gotta watch out for the missiles though, as they don't have a shield, and those cav charges as well. With that smaller unit size, they're not going to be able to last as long as some other bigger units potentially. They do encourage ally units as well, so they'll give them a little morale boost. A useful frontline unit of the stronger variety. And to a light sword infantry in the People's Warband. These are some dual sword wielding boys, and as such they can put out a lot of base damage. They don't have a lot of armor though, not a great deal of melee evasion, no missile defense, so they've got to be careful of those. A good damage dealer on unarmored units potentially. Got to watch out for the cav charges as well. They could flank round though if they can avoid those, as they do have pretty fast foot speed. So a bit of a glass cannon, lots of damage output potentially, but they are very vulnerable to being dead. The White Wave Veterans, another decent frontline unit. They've got some armor, they've got some missile protection, they've got alright melee evasion, a good bit of base damage and a nice charge. It says they have good morale on their unit card, but they really don't at only 34. But their real selling point is that they have guerrilla deployment, so they can deploy somewhere sneaky and try and ambush the enemy potentially. So you've got some options with these boys. They've got formations you can use as well, so could be a frontline unit, could be an ambusher, kind of just an upgraded version of the Yellow Turban Warriors. And finally for the melee infantry, the best of the best, the Yuzhia. They are unbreakable first of all, they've got a lot of armor on, they've got melee evasion, they've got missile protection, they've got good damage, both base and armor piercing. These boys have it all. If that isn't enough, they're immune to scare, they have guerrilla deployment, and they are double-R'd. So you can't go wrong with the Yuzhia. They are of course going to be expensive, but a very strong frontline choice potentially. They could be an ambusher again with that guerrilla deployment, but being unbreakable means they will have a lot of damage output. So they're a good all-rounder for putting out damage or for holding the line, or even for flanking, as they do have guerrilla deployment. A very strong unit all round. And onto our spear units, beginning with the ever-sucky Peasant Spearmen of course. Their stats do suck across the board apart from their high armor piercing damage, but they can still absolutely ruin cavalry with charge reflection. So if you can keep them stood still and get a cavalry to run into them, they will absolutely waste them. Potentially horrendously good value for money. If pretty much anything else happens to them though, they are dead. If they get engaged by infantry, shot by missiles, charged in the back by cavalry, they're probably dead. But either way, nice and cheap and good for getting in the way of the enemy if nothing else. Yellow Turban Spearmen, more of a proper spear unit, but much like the Yellow Turban Warriors, they are of the average variety. Okay stats across the board with some missile defense as they have a shield, and they've got some good armor piercing damage, but of course their main role is to look out for the cavalry and keep them at bay. They could however do okay on the front line with that armor piercing damage, but don't rely on them to hold the line for you as they don't have fantastic morale. If you're looking for something a bit jazzy, then the Bringers of Righteousness will bring you that jazz. A medium glaive and bow infantry. They can use this formation as you can see here, where they'll put glaives out front to protect the archers behind. Take note though, they do not have charge reflection it seems, so if a cavalry unit charges into them, they're not going to get utterly destroyed like they would charging into any other spear unit. But that being said, they will put damage on anyone they run into. They've got decent melee stats to fight infantry, they can shoot other missiles, and they can protect against cavalry with this kind of formation, so they're really a good independent unit that can look after themselves, who could maybe go off and do some crazy flanking. And then we have the Arm of the Supreme Peace. These boys don't mess around. They've got a lot of base damage and a decent amount of armor piercing damage, lots of melee evasion so they can survive fairly well, got some armor, no protection from missiles though, so they have to be careful of those. But these boys are a special damage dealer unit. They have a very small unit size for a reason. They put out a lot of damage and it's splash attacks, so they're going to hit more than one man with their attacks, which means they're just going to destroy everything. So if you can keep them safe, they will put out a lot of damage on all kinds of enemies. On to Guardians of the Land, listed as a frontline unit because they have a lot of armor, decent melee evasion and okay morale. Their damage is mostly armor piercing, so potentially good damage output on infantry. Of course going to be great at taking down that cavalry when they're braced or when they're not. Their biggest downside though is not having any kind of missile protection, which as a frontline unit can be pretty important, so you may want to think about that when you choose to put them on the front line or not. If you do want someone who can take a missile though, bring along some Reclaimers. They've got a big old shield with lots of missile protection. They're listed as an anti-cav unit, so of course protecting those flanks could be a great role for them, but they could go on the front line as well with some decent armor piercing damage, although you could argue they're a little bit lacking in the melee evasion for that role. So mostly cav destroyers. And lastly for the spear section, the Militia of Virtue. Now while it says they are light spear infantry, they actually have staffs, so they don't have charge reflection, don't use them to protect against cavalry, they will get destroyed. However, they are unbreakable. They have a lot of armor piercing damage somehow with a blunt stick. They've got great melee evasion, which means they'll survive well and potentially could put out a lot of damage over a prolonged period as they are unbreakable. But once again, their biggest downside is their lack of missile protection, so they could get absolutely destroyed and blasted by a few archer units if they're not careful. If they can survive that though, they'll be a great frontline unit for damaging the enemy or holding the line. Now for some archers, beginning with the peasant variety. Well, range and damage wise, they're as good as any other archer. They're lacking in the morale, the armor and the ammunition, so don't expect them to stick around for a long time if they get stuck in melee with anything, or if they get shot by other missile units. They really are just an expendable missile unit that you could maybe try and do some crazy things with, and it doesn't matter too much if they die. You'll probably want to upgrade them as soon as possible though. And Yellow Turban archers are who you're going to want to upgrade them to. They have the same range and damage as the peasants, but they have way more ammunition and some armor on, so they'll be able to trade with other missile units as well as damage any infantry or cavalry. Still sucky in melee of course, so your average archer unit really. If you're looking for someone more skillful with a bow, you may want to go for archery masters. They have more range than the previous two units, less armor piercing damage but way more base damage, so they'll be better at shooting at those softer targets. They're lacking in the armor themselves, but they do have some ranged block chance, so they can avoid those missiles, potentially helping them out facing other missile units. Although beware of their small unit size, as that may hinder them against other missiles. Their role is also listed as suppression, which means they slow down the enemy troops that they shoot at. So potential tactics to be used there with these boys, but either way a strong archer unit. And now to that unit that I can never pronounce correctly, Mien Uf Forest. I think that was pretty good. These boys are light bow infantry. Honestly, they're very similar to the Yellow Turban archers. They've got some armor, they've got similar range and similar damage. They can stand up in melee a little bit more with some decent armor piercing damage, but still not great, still lacking in the morale. But they do have guerrilla deployment, which is their biggest sell. So if you want to try some sneaky cheeky tactics, then these boys may be the better archer choice, provided you can protect them. And lastly, the Watchmen of the Peace, the only crossbow unit for the Yellow Turbans. A whole lot of range of course, a whole lot of armor piercing damage of course, a bit of a missile block chance because they have a shield on their back so they can potentially trade well with other missiles. Again, not terrible in melee, but still not going to do a lot. They might be able to take out other archers or some very cheap infantry they'll be able to do damage to. They've got a little bit of armor for that protection, so going to be the best choice for a ranged unit overall if you can afford them. So to the cavalry then, with horseback huntsmen, a missile cavalry, so got guerrilla deployment, got the skirmish ability so they can fire while moving and running away from things. Very much your typical harassing light cav to be honest. Not going to do fantastic in the melee, so keep them away from that. They could maybe cycle charge the back of a front line just for morale penalties. They're not going to do any damage really, but it'll still potentially help break units. How about some shock cavalry with the White Wave Horsemen? They are the only They're the only shock cavalry for the Yellow Turbans, so going to be the best ones for cycle charging. They've got that decent charge bonus, got some good armor piercing damage, got a little bit of armor on. Not a lot of melee evasion though, so keep them out of prolonged combat, as you should with shock cavalry. They're listed as anti-missile, but they're going to be the best choice for hammering the back of an enemy front line as well, which is a very powerful tactic in Three Kingdoms. Their damage is also mostly armor piercing, so good to target those heavier troops to help out your infantry perhaps. And one of their strongest traits may be their guerrilla deployment, allowing you to maybe take out some skirmishers or something pretty early. And then to our melee cavalries, beginning with Yellow Turban Horsemen. They are of course better in melee, so they had good melee evasion but less of a charge bonus, although it's still pretty good. Their damage is mostly of the base variety, so going to be good for chasing down those lightly armored targets, maybe missiles preferably. And they do have a shield, so they can protect against missiles if they should go after them. So yeah, the cheaper choice for getting after missiles I'd say. Save your shock cavalry for bashing infantry on the front line. And finally, if you want the best of the best in terms of cavalry for the Yellow Turbans, you'll bring the Virtuous Noblemen, Heavy Axe Cavalry. So their damage is predominantly armor piercing, so it could be better to look for those heavier troops. They've got a decent charge bonus still, good melee evasion, lots of armor on, missile protection, good morale. They're immune to scare and a bunch of other things, so they're a very strong cavalry overall. Going to be better for taking out enemy cavalry probably, and some of the enemy's tougher melee infantry perhaps. So there you go, all the units in the Yellow Turbans army. I hope this helps you understand the army a bit better, so you can use them more effectively in battle. From my observations, it seems like they should be played as a very aggressive faction, not sitting around skirmishing with missiles too much, as they don't have a lot of missile protection, don't have great archers themselves, and a lot of their powerful units have really small unit sizes. They'd benefit from getting into melee combat quickly. So there you go, the Yellow Turbans. I hope you've enjoyed this, thanks for watching, I'll see you in the future.